maybe in one of your relatively uninformed flurries, you ended up establishing a relationship with someone who was really not good for you. And that might mean, well, it was just a bad personality match. Or it might mean they really weren't good for you because, you can get pretty unlucky and you can get tangled up with someone who's very deceitful and very malevolent and who could care less about you, or maybe who even wants to hurt you. And then you can establish a trusting relationship with them, or at least you trust them. And then one day, you find out that they are not who they said they were, or even more importantly, they are not who you thought they were. And so then maybe you're in a committed relationship and they betray you with someone else. And so then you think, well, there you are at home, and you're perfectly happy about being at home, and then your partner comes home, and for one reason or another, you find out that they're having an affair, or that they've betrayed you, or that they've lied to you in some other spectacularly important way. And maybe it's a lover, and maybe it's a family member, and maybe it's a sibling, and maybe it's a friend, whatever. It doesn't matter. And so here's a way of thinking about it. The minute before they come home, you're in one place. And you remember, a place isn't just a place, right? A place is a place in time. Because we live in space-time. We live in time and place. And what that means is you can be in the same place in 1 minute and a completely different place in the next minute, even if you haven't even moved. And so place is a very, very complicated idea. So you're sitting at home and you're watching Oprah, and you're perfectly content to do that, and then the person comes home and the bottom of your world falls out. And then all of a sudden you're not where you thought you were. And it's a really weird place that you are now, because it's not where you were, that's for sure. But you also don't know where it is, because you don't know who that person is that's in that room with you. You don't know what your past with them was, or what it meant, or anything else about it, because it was predicated on absolute misperceptions. So none of your memories about those events are valid, even though you have them as memories. And then you have a worse problem, which is if you're betrayed badly enough, not only are you not going to understand your immediate past with that person, oh, and by the way, your future's also gone, so that's a big problem, as is your present has become radically more complex. But it's worse than that, because if you're really betrayed, you're also going to think, who am I that I could be that stupid? And then you're going to think, what is a human being that they can be that corrupt? And so not only have the fundamentals been kicked out of the substructure of your perceptions, but your notion of what it means to be you and what it means to be human might have been seriously disrupted. And the thing about that is that's a non-trivial event. People call that traumatic. It's like a physical wound. In fact, it certainly, if the trauma is great enough, it can produce a psychophysiological wound, because that sort of trauma, a deep betrayal is a good example, will damage your brain. And maybe you'll recover from it, and maybe you won't. And one of the ways that that's been represented forever in mythological stories is by being swallowed up by a subterranean beast. It's something that comes up from the depths and pulls you down, and then you're in it. Now, why is that? Well, that's an extraordinarily complicated question, but here's the answer as nearly as I can tell. We evolved a very complicated neuropsychological system to signal alarm. So that's anxiety, threat sensitivity, right? And that makes us freeze, for example. And when you look at how an animal uses that system, let's say a mammal, just to keep it simple, because we're all mammals, and so we can kind of understand mammals. So if a rabbit sees a wolf, for example, it's going to freeze so that the wolf can't see it. And if a rat smells a cat, even if it has never smelled a cat in its whole life, it's going to also freeze. And interestingly, with rats, if you put rats in a natural environment, which means they get to have little rat dominance hierarchies, little rat families, and they're not like little white rats alone in a cage. They're happy family rats. And they've got their burrows and they live in their little societies, and maybe there's a part of their territory where they can go get food. And they're used to that, so they'll scurry out there in the day, kind of hiding because they don't like light, or maybe they'll scurry out at night because rats are night things. And they'll get their food and they'll eat it or bring it back, or whatever they do, share it with their family, or at least bring it back. Well, let's say that you put a cat out there, or maybe you even just put a cat there and take it away so that the place smells like cat. Well, if one of those rats goes out there and sees that cat, first of all, it's going to freeze, and it is not a happy thing. Because imagine, you're a rat, and a thing that's 4 times as big as a lion suddenly appears on your front yard. Do you believe that there are things that you should do? Like, is there anyone here who doesn't believe that? Or more importantly, is there anyone here who doesn't act like they believe it? So you wake up in the morning and you think, yeah, there's a bunch of things I should do. Or there's some things I should do next week. Or there's some things I should do with my life. Yes? That's a common thought? Does anyone not think that way? Okay, so you know, if you're not thinking that way, you end up pretty depressed, because then you think, well, there's nothing I should do with my life. And that's not such a happy thought, because life is hard, and then if there's nothing to do with it, well, all you're there stuck with is a bunch of suffering, and that doesn't seem like a very good idea. Okay, so then you might say, well, what exactly does should mean? Well, it means that you have a moral obligation of some sort. You might say, well, you've decided that yourself. And the answer to that is, like, no, wrong. You haven't decided that yourself. Are you kidding? You'd be a complete psychopath if you decided that by yourself. Right? I mean, if you're even the vaguest bit civilized, then you decide what it is that you should do, or what you should do manifests itself within you as a context of a dialogue that you're continually having with yourself, but also with everyone around you. And not only with everyone around you, but with the entire history of mankind. Because we're all historical creatures, and you know, what you think you should do is being shaped by what your parents think, and that was shaped by what their parents thought, and that was shaped by what their parents thought, and so on back into the depths of history, as far back as you can possibly imagine, both historically and biologically. So in some sense, there is a call to action within people. Now, you know, in any sort of quest story, like The Hobbit, let's say, or The Lord of the Rings for that matter, you know, the story always starts with a call to action, right? For some reason or another, the little hobbit character, which, by the way, is you know, the hobbits live in this little protected place, and they're not very big, and they're not very smart, and they don't know about the wide world beyond them, where the great forces of good and evil are at combat. And one hobbit, who's a little bit more adventurous than the rest, gets called upon to act, and in the Hobbit stories, it's usually the wizard who manages it, right? So it's a magical figure of some sort who's extraordinarily wise and extraordinarily old, who might as well be God for all intents and purposes, who says, you know, it's time for you to go and become a thief. Well, that's what happens in The Hobbit, right? It's a very weird thing. There's a psychologist named Piaget. Some of you might know about him. Piaget was very interested in what happens to value structures and their hierarchical organization once they have to apply outside of the confines of a body. So here's a way of thinking about it. 2-year-olds basically hypothalamic. That's why they're so much fun. First they're happy, then they're sad, then they're hungry, then they're tired. You know, they just zip from one pretty straightforward and rather awe-inspiring motivational state to another. But at 2, they can't play. They can play by themselves, but they can't play with other children. They can't get that until they're 3. And they need to get it by the time they're 3, because if they don't get it by the time they're 4, they will never get it. And then you have an antisocial kid who's going to be an outsider for his entire life, and there isn't anything you can do about it. So that has to happen between 2 and 4. So what happens at about age 3 is that the kid learns how to play a game with another person. And what that game is fundamentally the development of the ability to share a frame of reference, which is what you're doing when you play Monopoly. It's like, it's stupid to play Monopoly, obviously. Who cares if you have a whole pile of counterfeit paper, right? But it doesn't matter, eh? Because the way you're constituted is that your brain will treat anything you act like constitutes a valuable goal as if it's a valid framework of reference. And if it couldn't do that, A, you couldn't abstract, and B, you could not get along with other people. So you can sit around the table and you can say, let's pretend that Monopoly is a reasonable facsimile of reality, which you wouldn't say, but it's what you mean. And everybody says, yes, that would be amusing. And so then you set your goal, which is to get all the little hotels and all the money, and poof, your emotions go along for the ride. And what's so interesting about that is you can get everybody into the game. And so one of the things that's really interesting about people is that we can establish a shared fictional frame of reference, and it organizes all our emotions so they're predictable. That's also why we can watch movies. You go to a movie, you identify the hero. You figure out what the hero wants, poof, you're the hero. And the way that works is, you don't look at the hero and think about what he's doing and evaluate it emotionally and then feel it. What you do is you specify the hero's goal and then you map him onto your body and you read off the emotional responses of your own body, and that's how you understand the hero. So it's embodied, you're using your embodiment as a computational device that can run simulations of other consciousnesses. And it does that with the body. And we like doing that. You can go to a movie and, you know, you're Brad Pitt for an hour and a half. You know, and you're Brad Pitt doing remarkable things. And that's also how we understand other people. We're very good at that. So anyways, we have these shared frames of reference, like when we're playing Monopoly. Okay, so children at 3 learn how to play games. And that means they learn how to organize their own internal motivational states into a hierarchy that includes the motivational states of other people. And that means they can play. And that's what you guys do when you're out in the world. Like, we're playing a game right now. We all know the rules. That's why we can all sit in this room and play the game without fighting with each other. You know, and the room is set up like a theater, and we all know the theater game. And the chairs are always facing this way at the moment, and so that's a hint that you should look forward, and this is raised, so, you know, the room is basically telling you what to do, because it's a stage, like all rooms, and because you're smart and socially conscious, you can walk into a staged room, and your body knows what to do. And if you're civilized and social, you just do it, then all the other primates can predict what you're up to, and they won't kill you. Yeah, well, that's what it means to be part of the same tribe. You know, and people are very peculiar creatures, and God only knows what they're up to. But as long as they're playing the same game you are, you don't have to know what they're up to, because you can predict what they're going to do, and you understand their motivational states. And so, part of the building and constructing of higher order moral goals is the establishment of joint frames of reference that allow multiple people to pursue the goals that they're interested in simultaneously. And then what you have to think about with regards to that is that not all shared frames of reference can manage that. There's a small subset of them that are optimized so that not only can multiple people play them, but multiple people can play them and enjoy them and do it repeatedly across a long period of time. So it's iteratability that partly defines the utility of a higher order moral structure, and that is not arbitrary. It's an emergent property of biological interactions, and you might say, well, it's kind of arbitrary because people can do what they want, but it's not arbitrary at all, because a lot of what's constraining your games is your motivational substructure and those ancient circuits that are status-oriented. And they operate within virtually every animal has a status counter. Creatures organize themselves into dominance hierarchies. The reason they do that is because that works. It's a solution to the Darwinian problem of existence. It's not just an epiphenomena. It's the real thing. So your environment, fundamentally, a huge chunk of your environment is dominance hierarchy, plus God only knows where you are. And that's order and chaos. And part of the reason that people fight to preserve their dominance hierarchies is because it's better to be a slave who knows what the hell is going on than someone who's thrown screaming and naked into the jungle at night. And that's the difference between order and chaos. And we like order better than chaos, and it's no wonder. Now, we'll invite a little chaos in for entertainment now and then, but it has to be done voluntarily. And generally, you don't want the kind of chaos that upsets your entire conceptual structure. You know, you're willing to fool around on the fringes a little bit, but, you know, when the going gets serious, you're pretty much likely to bail out. And no wonder. Piaget was very interested in how you produce structures that enable you to regulate yourself, because you're like a kind of a colony of strange sub-animals that have to figure out how to get along so that you can sort of be one thing. You kind of learn that, I would say, between the ages of 2 and 4 as you're being socialized. You know how erratic 2-year-olds are. I mean, they're a blast, and it's partly because they're erratic. It's like they're unbelievably happy, and then they're unbelievably hungry, and then they're really hot, and then they're really upset and crying, you know, and then they're really scared. It's like, and all of that's just untrammeled, and so it's really fun to be around them, especially when they're happy, because they're so happy that it's just, you know, you don't ever get to be that happy. And so it's nice to be around a 2-year-old because you can kind of feel that again, you know. And one of the horrible things about being a parent is that you spend a tremendous amount of your time making your child less happy. And the reason for that is that positive emotion is very impulsive, you know, and you know, because everybody says, well, you should be happy. It's like, well, no. When you're happy, you're actually quite stupid. And so, because happiness makes you impulsive, happiness says, hey, things are really good right now, get what you can while the getting's good. And so, like if you're hyper optimistic, manic, we'll say, it's like every stock investment looks like a really good stock investment. It's like you go out and spend all your money because look at, there's those wonderful things everywhere and you could do such great things with them, and then, you know, you spend all your money and then you crash and you think, oh God, my life's over, you know, because I just spent all my money on all this useless stuff, and it's all under the grip of impulsive positive emotion, you know. And so when you're telling your kids to be quiet and settle down, it isn't because they're making a lot of noise being in pain, it's because they're running around like wild baboons having a blast and disrupting things like mad, you know. And so you got kids, you got to settle down, you know, like quit having so much fun. And it's kind of awful that you do that, but you do. And that's because the emotions and the motivations have to be brought into like a relationship with one another within the person, so that, you know, one thing I remember with my son, who is he's quite disagreeable by temperament, which is actually a good thing as far as I'm concerned, although it brings its own challenges. And so with my daughter, when she was misbehaving, she was pretty agreeable, and you know, if she was misbehaving, I could basically just look at her and then she'd quit, you know. But my son, it was like, that was just nothing. You're looking at me? It's like, no, that's just not going to go anywhere, man. And so then I'd like tell him to stop, and that really wasn't having much of an effect either. He'd just sort of maybe laugh or run away or whatever. I mean, he was a tough little rat. And you know, what I would do with him is he would be doing something and I'd interfere and he'd get upset and, you know, angry. And so then I'd get him to sit on the steps, and I told him, and this is when he was about 2, I said, look, you're going to sit on the steps, that's time out. You're going to sit on the steps until you've got control of yourself and you can come back and play the family game again. I basically said, be a civilized human being and then you're welcome again. And so he'd sit on the steps, and it was so interesting to watch because he was just enraged. He'd sit there, like, have you ever seen a 2-year-old have a temper tantrum? It's really quite the bloody phenomena. If you ever saw an adult do that, you'd call 911 right away. It's like, oh my God. And I've seen adults do that, you know, because people say with borderline personality disorder will have temper tantrums, and it's like, man, you want to be about 30 feet away from that person, that's for sure. It's really, but in kids it's like, well, first of all, they're only this long, so how much trouble can they really cause? But it's like, you know, they're just completely gone. They're like on the floor, their face is red, they're just furious, like way more furious than you ever get if you're even vaguely socialized. They're just outraged, and they're kicking and hitting the ground, and like, it's like a little epileptic fit of anger, you know. They're completely controlled by their rage. And we took care of one kid for a while who, he was actually a pushover, that kid. You could get him to behave by, you know, kind of shaking your finger at him, but his mother thought he was really tough because he had her figured out. And one of the things he would do is have a temper tantrum, and during the temper tantrum he would hold his bloody breath until he turned blue. It's like, try that, like, you know, that's your homework. Go home and have a temper tantrum, and while you're doing it, hold your breath until you actually turn blue. It's like, you won't be able to do it. You don't have the willpower of a 2-year-old, that's for sure. That little varmint, man, he'd just have a fit, then he'd hold his breath, and then he'd turn blue. It was like, wow, that's amazing. And we would just like let him do it, and you know, he'd turn blue and everybody would be gone and he'd come out of it, you know, and it didn't work, so he just quit doing it. I think he did it like twice, and he figured out, oh well, that's a lot of work for very little outcome. And you know, it's not like 2-year-olds are stupid. They're not stupid. They're probably smarter than you, but they're not civilized by any stretch of the imagination. And so anyways, back to my son, I'd put him on the steps and he'd be like, just like enraged and trying to get himself together, you know. And I'd wait a few, I got a strict rule, which was, as soon as you're done, you're welcome again. So it's completely under your control. You get yourself calmed down, you come and talk to me again. If you're calm enough so I like you, then you're welcome back in the family. No grudge, nothing. And so it's harder than you think. Like, people think they like their kids. It's like, don't be thinking that. They're hard to like. They're little monsters, and they're very, very pushy and provocative. And so lots of parents do not like their children, and they do terrible things to them their whole life. So it's no joke, and it's very common. And you know, that was Freud's observation, fundamental observation, that a lot of psychopathology is rooted in the family, and you can be sure of that. You know, and when you hear about some mother who's done something terrible to her child, which happens reasonably frequently, you know perfectly well that she has a very terrible capacity to discipline. The child's just provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her and provoked her, and it just happens to be a day where her new boyfriend left and she's quite hungover and she got fired, and it's like, that's the wrong day to provoke her. And then she does something that is not good, and you read about it and you think, well, how could that happen? How could anyone do that? Well, that's how they do it. And so, and kids are very provocative, just like little chimps. Chimps will, the adolescents will like throw little pebbles and sticks at the sleeping larger males and bug them. And that teasing, which it is, that teasing turns into full-fledged dominance challenge behavior once the adolescent males get big enough to do it. And so when you're being provoked by a child, which they provoke you all the time, they're trying to figure out, well, just where are you exactly? What happens if I do this? What happens if I do this? You know, and how else are they going to figure it out? Anyways, he'd sit on the steps and he's just enraged and trying to control himself, and I'd watch that, and then, you know, I'd come back after about 2 minutes or whatever, and he'd still be, Rrr! I'd say, well, you know, have you got yourself under control? Are you ready to get off the steps? He'd go, no, not yet! And then, you know, he'd get himself under control, and then he'd come back and, you know, he'd be contrite, and then I would like him right away, you know. You got to watch that, you know, because you don't like being dominated by a 2-year-old. No one does. And so if the child hasn't mastered himself and started to act in accordance with the prevailing social norms, you won't like them. Well, you think, oh yeah, I will, because, you know, I'm a good person. It's like, no, you won't, and no, you're not a good person, so don't be thinking about that at all. It's just not true. So when he was contrite, then he'd come, and then, you know, we just go on like nothing had happened, because that's what you want to do, right? As soon as you get compliance, especially if the compliance is in the best interest of the child, you want to reward it instantly, right? That's the right thing to do, because so then, and you could just see him gaining control over himself. And so really what was happening is in his mind, in his brain, we'll say, there was a war between the psyche, the ego, that was starting to become integrated, you know, and starting to become a continuous person, an identity. And it's fragile in 2-year-olds, and it can be disrupted all the time, and it is. That's why they're so hyper emotional. It's fragile, that little ego, and it doesn't have a lot of power. And so what you want to do is reward it when it wins. You know, it's when he gets control over the underlying motivations, you want to say, hey, good work, man, good work, kid, you did it, you know, you got yourself under control, way to be. And the kid's really happy about that, because it's actually not that much fun to have a temper tantrum. It's exhausting, you know, it takes you over.